Hey, welcome everyone. We're going to give it a few more seconds to give folks an opportunity to join. All right. Okay, so good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Jeanne Ortiz, and I am a senior program manager at Pro Bono Net. Thank you so much for your interest in today's training. This is a beginner's guide to appealing the Federal Emergency Management Agency's disaster assistance determination. And this training is hosted by Pro Bono Net in partnership with Legal Aid of Sonoma County. And it is for those currently assisting disaster survivors and for people who want to learn more about the FEMA appeal process in preparation for a future disaster. So we want to make this an engaging session, so please use the chat to share your practical tips or resources with other attendees if you'd like to do that. And please use the Q&A function to ask questions. We will go through the questions submitted via the Q&A at the end of the training. And when you ask your question, we just request that you please refer to the section of the training so that we know what your question is about at the end. All of the materials of today's training have also been uploaded. You can access those via the chat. And in addition, attendees that would like to view a live transcription of the training can do so by enabling the setting under the show captions icon. All of the materials also will be posted to the online library of the Advocate Network of advocatesfordisasterjustice.org. If you're already a member of ADJ, all you need to do is log in and go to the link highlighted in yellow to access the materials. If you're not a member of ADJ, you can create a free account to access the library. And you can access all of these links as well in the presentation materials, and we'll also follow up with a post-webinar email with this information. So a little more of Pro Bono Net. We're a national nonprofit organization based in New York City, and our mission is to bring the power of the law to all by building cutting-edge digital tools and fostering collaborations with the nation's leading civil legal organizations. And we do our work through a variety of programs that reach millions of people every year. And we are proud to work with multiple organizations around the country that provide free legal services and self-help resources, including to people impacted by climate-driven disasters. So as I said, my name is Jeanne, and I'm a senior program manager here at Pro Bono Net. My pronouns are she, her, and ella in Spanish. I am also the Vice Director of the American Bar Association Disaster Legal Services Program. I am joined by Kendall Jarvis, a lead disaster relief attorney at Legal Aid of Sonoma County and a member of the Disaster Legal Assistance Collaborative in California. And Kendall also uses she, her pronouns and ella in Spanish. Joining us as well is Sanam Malik, project manager at Pro Bono Net. Pronouns she, her, and she is behind the Zoom controls today and monitoring any technical issues or questions that you may have. Okay, so let's dive right into this. I'm going to first share a few key resources related to FEMA. Kendall will then walk us through FEMA's assistance program, then do a deeper dive into the FEMA appeals process, and then I'll wrap up by walking through how to create an appeal letter using Pro Bono Net's free online program, and we'll have the last 10 to 15 minutes to address questions. Okay, and so instead of sharing resources at the very end of the training, I want to highlight them at the beginning so you know what we'll be referring to throughout the training. All of the materials that you'll hear throughout the training are available here. This is formerly known as disasterlegalaid.org, but Advocates for Disaster Justice is a collaboration of several organizations and has grown into the largest national network of justice advocates and allies working with communities impacted by climate-driven disasters. We also encourage you to check out all the materials and other resources posted there. For anything related to FEMA and their appeal process, you can refer to these slides, which list the Stafford Act, the Individual Assistance Program and Policy Guide, and also important changes from last year to the application and appeal process with FEMA. And then finally, just to note that these trainings will be running through September of this year. So if you know of someone else or another organization in your community that could benefit from these trainings, please feel free to share. We've linked the information here for your convenience. Our next training will include information specific to disaster survivors in California, and our August training will focus on appealing FEMA's disaster assistance determination if an applicant needs disability accommodations. Our September training will be very similar to today's training, but we'll have Spanish interpretation available because the FEMA Appeal Letter online program that we host is also available in Spanish. And for the benefit of those who speak Spanish, I'll share this in Spanish as well. Nuestro adiestramiento de septiembre tendrá interpretación disponible en español para aquellas personas que estén interesadas en conocer cómo nuestro programa para crear una carta de apelación a FEMA funciona. Todos estos enlaces de registro están disponibles en la presentación, así que lo pueden acceder a su conveniencia y compartir con otras organizaciones. With that said, we're going to kick things off with Kendall.
Good morning or afternoon, depending where you're joining from. As Jeanne said, I'm Kendall Jarvis. I'm the lead disaster relief attorney with Legal Aid of Sonoma County. We started the disaster relief program after the 2017 fires in Sonoma and Napa counties that were pretty devastating and have continued on since then. So I've done a lot of work, obviously, with wildfires, but also helping other states sort of address how to create disaster relief programs. So today, we're just going to take a dive into a few of FEMA's main programs, really the main things that you would be dealing with. I just want to note that to say that there are additional programs like the Transitional Sheltering Authority that can or the debris removal process that you might want information about. And if that's true, feel free to reach out to me via email, or you can even ask those questions in Q&A. But for the purposes of the presentation, we're going to keep it to their three main programs. Next slide, please. So as you know, FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and they manage and coordinate basically essentially all federal disaster relief and assistance programs. The important thing to really know about this is that they have an enabling act, the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. And that act has been updated over the years. So Congress has the authority to essentially push regulatory changes through FEMA, which can be very helpful. And we'll talk about some of those changes later. But we've seen that a lot of these conversations, presentations, policy work really has a positive impact. So keep that in mind when you're working with people. If you see issues that arise that you want to discuss or that are consistent, it is definitely worth it to reach out to us or other disaster relief related programs or FEMA themselves to have that. The other thing to know is that FEMA doesn't always come in. So this is a question that's often asked where people will be like, what do you mean? Our community had a disaster. Why don't we have a FEMA declaration? And the truth is there are thousands of quote unquote locally declared or state declared disasters throughout the United States and its territories every year. And not all of them get FEMA assistance. So the goal of FEMA assistance from the public assistance standpoint, meaning the one that helps individuals, which we call an individual assistance declaration, is really to note that the scale of the disaster was so large that there's no way that the community, local government, CBOs, community-based organizations, or the state could tackle or handle the financial struggle and coordination of responding to and helping people recover from that. So you will see disasters that unfortunately do not get a FEMA individual assistance declaration. And then you will see others that do. And then you will see some that just get financial support for the immediate response needs. So you want to be clear about that when you're looking into whether you can help people and how helpful you can be. Really, for the purposes of what we're talking about today, we're talking about counties, states that have had individual assistance declarations where you can help an individual family and household. respond to their needs through a FEMA program. Next slide. So on that note, FEMA has essentially three main programs. As I said, they do have other programs, and if you have questions about that, feel free to research, email me. I'm happy to answer questions about that. But for today, the three main programs that people basically have to push through start with the Individuals and Households program, which we also call IHP. That program is designed to really help people with essential personal property and then temporary housing. So this is kind of a complex question. What is essential personal property? If you're in a situation where you've lost everything, or maybe this stuff exists, but it's not usable because of a flood or some other event where it's basically not valid for daily use anymore. We're really talking about things that as a community, as a country, we see as things that people need to just survive on a daily basis. So this isn't like I lost my stereo, right? This is like I need clothes, I need a bed, I need work tools, or I can't continue my job. Things of that nature that are pretty immediate in needs, if that makes sense. And the temporary housing piece is important to bring up because it's a little different for homeowners than it is for renters. And the reason for this is that if you are a renter before a disaster and you're a renter after, there's a question of why would you need temporary housing support in the sense of, let's say, for example, I was a survivor pre-disaster, I paid $2,000 a month for rent. Post-disaster, I can't find anywhere to live with my family of five for less than $3,500 a month in rent. So that is a financial strain on our household. And that's something that could lead to homelessness, being precariously housed. So that is something that can potentially be addressed by FEMA, right? However, if I was a renter before and I paid $2,000 and I'm a renter after and I'm paying $2,000, I don't have that need. So when they're looking at it from a rentership standpoint, they really are looking at what was your pre-disaster life financially in terms of your housing. And then how can we put you back to the same or similar situation, right? The reason that's different for homeowners is for two reasons. One, they have often insurance. If they do have insurance, they may have something called loss of use or additional living expense coverage, which pays for temporary housing, at least to an extent. So if they don't or aren't insured, then they still have to pay their mortgage. So this temporary housing is really looking at what is the financial impact on that household of their pre-disaster situation to their post-disaster. For example, if you're a homeowner, let's say you live in a manufactured home and you had in a park and you had park fees of $500 a month, right? And then afterwards, your home is lost and those fees are not required to be paid, then they're really looking at, okay, well, then you had $500 before that you were paying towards your house. And now if your rent is going to be $1,500 or $2,000, that's where the question comes in. They obviously don't just supply endless amounts of money. This is based on AMI or the average median income. So it varies by area, but it is basically set up with the hope that people who need housing can get into housing and have the financial gap covered if necessary. So everyone gets pushed into the IHP program. Secondarily, the SBA or the Small Business Administration is a little misleading in the sense of its name. So people are like, well, I'm not a small business, or they view it as purely a loan program. The truth is, it is purely a loan program, but it's not purely for small businesses. It can be, but it can also be to help households and their families get back on their feet. So generally, you can apply for a loan as an individual and household for up to $200,000 to repair, rebuild your house, right? And $40,000 to replace your personal property. So it's worth it to go through this program. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, well, yeah, but I can't afford a loan. It's worth it to go through this program regardless, because for two reasons. One, if you get rejected for a loan, you automatically get pushed through to the third program, other needs assistance, or what we call ONA. If you don't apply, you don't get pushed through to that program. And even if you apply to the SBA and you get approved, you could potentially appeal to say, hey, thank you so much for thinking I'm loan worthy. But the truth is that I have way more expenses every month than would allow me to meet this essentially debt ratio, right? So I encourage people to go through it. You don't have to draw on the loan if you don't want to. It is, purely a decisionary thing. If they can, it's great. If they can't, you can appeal it. And at minimum, it should help push you to the third program, which is other needs assistance. And other needs assistance is kind of similar to the first, but broader. So it is designed to help with broader needs. And that can be related to real or personal property replacement. It could be related to repairing something. Like we see things come up where people lost a car, and contrary to popular belief, unless you have pretty significant umbrella coverage on a vehicle, generally your car insurance is not going to cover the cost to replace your car if it's lost in a disaster. So if that happens, you can use O&A to say, look, I need a car for work. I need a car to take my kids to school. It can help with things like daycare. It can help with infrastructural things with your property. If you're rural, potentially fixing a septic unit or a well. So it's a broader pot of grant funding, which is why it's super important to try and get people through to that program if you can. Next slide, please. So common reasons why FEMA denies help. We see this all the time. And the reality is it's sort of the few that ruined it for the whole. It used to be much easier to get FEMA assistance, but after Katrina, Congress really sort of tamped down on access to assistance without very, very clear documentation of need. And for that reason, FEMA was sort of directed to come up with regulations that kind of limited who and why they were providing funds. And one of those automatic things is if you have insurance. So if you're a survivor and you apply and you say, yes, I have insurance coverage, they're not going to come back and ask you how much insurance coverage you have. They're going to say, okay, well, then you don't need our help. The reality is most of the time people are not adequately insured, so they actually do need the help. And the real question that FEMA is searching for is, do you have an unmet financial need that's not covered by any other resources, whether that be insurance or CBO, community-based organization, or a grant of some kind, right? And we know that most people do. So don't be dissuaded by that, because the way that the letter presents it makes it appear like it's just a straight denial. And that's really not what it is in the same sense. I mean, keep in mind, this is kind of a difficult question to say, here's your line in the sand where we know you should apply here if you have coverage and you shouldn't apply here if you have coverage. But I always look at it, or at least think it's worth appealing if you have a client that comes to you and they have an outstanding unmet need that's not met by another resource. It makes sense to at least ask. The other thing that we frequently see is really inadequate documentation. And that's a problem for a number of reasons. But for the survivor, the biggest problem that they face is that they don't have easy access to all the documentation that's requested. I actually don't think a lot of people in general keep amazing files on, their insurance, their healthcare, their marital status, their lease agreement, their, title to their house, right? Every utility bill. These are things that are used to prove that you should be eligible for FEMA benefits as a primary residence holder, right? And if you don't have access to that, it becomes problematic. So people have sometimes a difficult time understanding exactly what kind of documentation they need or obtaining that documentation. So, we'll talk a little bit later about some ways to be creative and some things that have shifted in terms of documentation providing, but that is something that purely because you don't have the document, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't appeal. And then there's always the duplication of benefit issue and the primary occupancy or ownership. So it has to be the main home that you and your family lived in. It can't be a secondary home. A landlord can't apply on behalf of a tenant. It has to be someone who lived there and that used it as their primary occupancy, and they have to establish that. And again, that dovetails back with the documentation piece, and we'll talk about some strategies a little later. And then the receiving benefits from something else is from someone else is a little more simplistic. It's more that in disasters, a lot of times people will give like gift cards and will say, here's $500 for this, or here's, a Red Cross grant for $1,500. And it doesn't have a clear directive on what that is used for. So FEMA's like, well, we were told that you received this or you received that. But the real question is, was the money presented for something that FEMA covers, like essential personal property, home repairs, temporary housing, right? So it's good to look at those things and push back if it shouldn't, right? If someone got a hotel voucher, then that hotel voucher shouldn't prevent them from getting benefits moving forward. Next slide, please. So how do we appeal, right? What does that even mean? I will say almost everyone has to appeal FEMA decisions. You do hear some of those amazing stories where someone just signs up and registers in a local assistance center or disaster recovery center, and they get, the direct deposit from FEMA saying like, we know you need this help, use it for temporary housing, right? That is unfortunately not the general experience for those of us that are trying to help people in this scenario or situation. So it is very common to need to appeal, and not just appeal initially, but appeal potentially many times through the different programs. So it's important to note that you can appeal almost anything about a FEMA decision within either of the programs. You can appeal if you were denied generally. You can appeal if the amount that was provided you don't agree with. You can appeal if your temporary housing isn't adequate. You can appeal the loan perspective. So, think of this as broad in terms of what you can appeal. And, if you're willing to stick in there, you can generally have success, at least in my experience and opinion. Next slide, please. Who could submit an appeal? Well, the truth is we used to feel like it had to be an attorney. I am an attorney, but I'm a firm believer that that's not the case. I think that just from a logistical standpoint, the applicant themselves obviously has a right to appeal, right? An attorney can obviously help you, but the other thing is it's really important to think about who else can help, right? And what we've seen is disaster case managers being incredibly helpful on the ground. We're working through a librarian program where we can help train librarians to help people appeal their FEMA decision. And obviously the obvious, a friend or a family member, someone that can take a little bit of the burden off the survivor, because that's so often the problem, is that it just is too much. It's asking a little too much when someone has already gone through so much already, right? Next slide, please. So how can attorneys and advocates help? I think that this is, as I was just saying, is a question that has kind of shifted over the years. And it used to appear kind of scary to try and help a survivor, because there were these regulations and rules that were like, hey, you have to fill out all this paperwork, you have to get consent and authorization, you have to be the first line of contact for FEMA. That's not what we did in 2017, and it hasn't been what we've done in subsequent disasters, because that takes a lot of stress and pressure and places it on a third party. So the reality is it's a lot easier to help someone help themselves. So we want to make sure that we're helping people get their paperwork together and identifying what is appealable and what do you have to put into an appeal, right? Keeping track of timelines and things that they might not be able to do, helping them gather documentation or identify creative ways of getting documentation if it's not obviously available in a more traditional setting, right? Like, for example, if FEMA asks for a lease and someone says, I don't have a lease agreement because it was destroyed. Well, what else can you do, right? You can write the landlord. You can ask the landlord to send a copy if they have it. You can ask them to write a letter. If they won't cooperate, you can ask neighbors to say, hey, this person lived here. I've been living next door to them for 5 years, you know? So those kinds of things are really, really, really helpful. And I can't stress enough that the amount of sort of loss and trauma that a survivor goes through, it's compounded by the fact that they also don't have access to the things that we take for granted daily, right? They might not even have a phone. They might generally don't have a printer, right? No one's taking their printer with them when they're fleeing their house. Generally, they don't take their laptop or computer if they're fortunate enough to have one. So there is, let alone, right, take their files or the things that could help. So even simple things can make a huge difference, like having someone come down and meet with you and just say, hey, I'll make copies for you. I'll help you organize your documentation. These things are so invaluable and something we generally don't talk about all the time because it has seemed it's a little scary to get involved with a federal agency, right? You're like, that's not like, the thing we all want to hear from on a day-to-day basis. But here it really is, the community coming together, people supporting each other. That's the way that we have the most success advocating for survivors, especially in the FEMA appeals process and the survivor generally. Next slide, please. So this is an interesting thing, and something that comes up a lot is there's a belief generally that if you're undocumented, you don't qualify. In theory, that is true, meaning the eligibility requirements related to FEMA are that you are 18 or older, it's your primary occupancy, you're lawfully in the United States, right? You had a disaster loss that is not covered by any other means related to the declared event. Okay, that's sort of your base starting point, or should you not be eligible. The problem with that is that it comes up that then people think, okay, well, if anyone in the household is undocumented, then that means that we don't qualify as a household. That's not true. The truth is you really only need one person who is lawfully in the United States in the household to be eligible for your entire household to receive benefits. The problem that I run into from sort of a more moral standpoint is that really has to be the decision of the household, because FEMA will require information about all members of the household. So you will have to share the information about the undocumented people. FEMA has stated that they won't use it against someone for the purposes of, deportation or things like that. However, the information is kept, it's stored. So we can't guarantee that that would never happen. So I always run into this catch-22, but I do think it's important to say, and help people understand, if there is at least one person lawfully in the United States in the household can qualify. So from there, it's up to them. Do they want to qualify, right? As a household, do they want to come forward and say, hey, here's our person who's lawfully in the United States. We have 3 other people that aren't lawfully in the United States. Here's their names and information, and then get benefits. I can say that I have not seen FEMA use this in a negative way, but it is something that should be considered. And, hopefully we can help people understand that they can be eligible while also, not putting them at risk. Next slide, please. So what the FEMA appeal should include. I'm going to go through this just briefly because Jeannie's going to touch on this with a tool, the amazing tool that Pro Bono Net has that makes it easier. But there are just very specific things that FEMA requires in terms of your name, your date of birth, your disaster number, your FEMA registration number that's specific to the household application, the reason for the appeal, the date, the mailing address, the lost address, and then obviously language explaining the reason for the appeal. It can be very helpful to keep this simple and, I'm writing today to appeal FEMA's decision regarding X. Here's why, and here's the supporting documentation. And the other thing I want to say about this is that the explanation is important, but what is generally the most important is the supporting documentation. You want to have the information available to FEMA to make it easier for them to say yes rather than no. Next slide, please. So, as I said before, how do you help, right? This is something that when I started down this path and started the disaster relief program in Sonoma, everything that I read was like, you have to be an attorney, you have to sign documentation that says you're going to be the main point of contact and the only point of contact. And really, it just terrified people. And I was trying to get this clinic off the ground with volunteer attorneys. And I would literally tell them, please don't watch this beforehand because it's going to terrify you. So of course, most of them watched it anyway, right? Being attorneys, they wanted to know, like, what am I getting myself into? Well, it really, really does not have to be this complicated. I look at this as like law school 101. As I said before, I don't even think you have to be an attorney to do it. I mean, obviously it can help, but I think that anyone that is willing to advocate for someone has the ability to just kind of look at the big picture and say, hey, what is the most creative way that I can respond to this effectively? And what documentation can I possibly gain access to help the survivor push their appeal forward with FEMA? And the other thing I will say is, when in doubt, feel free to submit an appeal, even if you feel like it's not good enough. Don't wait too long to wait on that additional documentation. If you can easily access it, that's great. But if you can't, it's better to present something and then come back again. And I will say, sometimes you submit a FEMA appeal and you make a phone call to FEMA, which I recommend doing anytime you're helping. Just call FEMA straight away. And then FEMA says, great, this is resolved. Other times it's like, here's 7 different appeals for the same issue. So, you really just need to be viewing this from an advocacy lens. How can I best push this to the next step, right? Next slide, please. So, helping with a FEMA appeal. There are some things that come up here where sometimes people want the applicant's full file, so they can basically see why FEMA made the decisions they made, rather than just what the decisions are that were made, right? So standardly, a survivor is going to get access to any letter that is received from FEMA in terms of correspondence or reasons for denial, right? But they're not going to get, every exchange of phone calls that occurred, or behind the scenes reasoning that supported the denial or things like that. So sometimes people find it necessary, either as a survivor or an advocate, to get the complete file. You can do that, as it says right there on the screen. Really, it's just an authorization for release of information. You can call FEMA. FEMA can send it to you. The survivor can fill it out. You then sign it, and they can provide that information back to you. It just opens up the ability to share. I just want to highlight, I don't think this is always necessary. In fact, I think it's rarely necessary unless you have like a really sticky situation. But short of that, I think the easier thing to do is to see if your client or whichever survivor you're helping in whatever capacity, if they can create an online account with disasterassistance.gov, that's going to give you access to any letter that FEMA believes they sent to survivors. And I say believes because one of the things we see is that survivors move a lot. So it is not necessarily true that the survivor is actually getting the mail in a timely fashion by the time they move, even if they are updating their mailing address as they go forward. So the disasterassistance.gov portal really just helps you see what FEMA believes they've sent and then what they believe they've received from the survivor. Because a survivor may say, well, yeah, I mailed in a copy of my lease, but maybe FEMA didn't get it for whatever reason, right? We know that it's literally USPS has a huge burden on their shoulders after any kind of disastrous event. So it's not unheard of for things to take way too long to get to where they're supposed to be going, or be lost in the shuffle, or the survivor's overwhelmed and maybe they forgot a stamp, right? There could be very simple explanations of, why information didn't get there that the survivor believes did. So I definitely recommend doing that. I can't stress it enough. Next slide, please. 7 steps to follow. As we've said, gather your documents, review any denial letters, make that account online. It's super helpful. Just determine your best argument or be creative in that situation. What is the best argument you can come up with to say why this person, the survivor, this household deserves benefits, right? Draft the appeal letter. Jeannie's going to talk about that, so I'm going to skip through that. Make sure you're attaching documentation to support your appeal. That is one thing that we have just learned time and time again. FEMA loves supporting documentation. If you don't have the right documentation, just be creative in other ways of establishing whatever it is that they're asking you to establish. And then make sure you put everything on their name, date of birth, all the things on the other slide. And obviously have the applicant sign and submit the appeal. Common mistakes. There's so many. No, I'm just kidding. Really, the biggest thing that's a problem is timeline. And people they'll either come to you way too late and they'll say, oh, well, I didn't realize it was 60 days from this day or that day. I thought because I had a phone conversation. The biggest problem is timeline. So make sure you're aware of the timeline before helping anyone, because that's something that, really needs to be abided by. I will say that I've had a number of survivors come and say, well, I missed this timeline. And the truth is you can still submit an appeal. It's just FEMA doesn't have to take it. So if you miss that deadline, just provide a good faith reason. And I'm of the opinion that if you're a survivor, you've lost everything, you don't have access to documentation, and you're incredibly stressed out and traumatized, that in itself is a good reason why you missed a deadline, right? But all in all, whatever the circumstances are, just include that. And then again, just to highlight the insurance thing. Don't, just because someone got rejected because they were insured does not mean that they're necessarily not eligible. You just need to establish they have outstanding unmet needs not covered by any other source. Next slide. Proof of primary residency is always a problem. We know this. The biggest issue, I'm going to hold on to this because we have some highlights. Next slide. We have some highlights that dovetail right with this. So let's go back. What happens after a FEMA appeal? Basically, FEMA reviews the response. They're supposed to give you a decision within 30 days. I do recommend that you call them because obviously people are in need of money in this situation, right? So if you call them, you can help push that forward. If the person on the phone isn't helpful, you can always ask to talk to a supervisor. They may be able to push it forward. So it's very helpful to follow up, but know minimally they have to respond within 30 days. And then also know that FEMA appeals are often denied because they don't have adequate documentation, or, they have insurance or whatever. So you might need to follow up again or a couple more times to provide additional documentation. And if you disagree with the decision overall, appeal again, right? You can appeal the decision, you can appeal the amount of the award, you can kind of appeal anything. So be open to that. Next slide, please. So point being, file a FEMA appeal. It's always worth it to file a FEMA appeal in my mind. And when you don't know what to do or you're not sure what's going on, which happens a lot, just give FEMA a call. They generally can help. If the person on the phone is not helpful, ask to talk to a supervisor. It's very worth it. They say 1 out of 3 FEMA appeals are actually resolved over the phone. So that number could be even higher, at certain times. So I definitely recommend trying that. Don't forget your timelines. As we said, don't forget your supporting documentation. Create an account. I can't stress that enough. It can be super helpful. And then be aware of the eligibility requirements that we all said. And if you need to, have the conversation about being undocumented. Next slide. So this was the part that I skipped over just a couple of moments ago. So there have been some recent changes to federal law Congress directed FEMA basically to review their regulations, and the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, or the DRRA. As part of that, FEMA had to go through and basically address certain things that have been viewed as systemic problems from a deep dive, for lack of a better term. One of those things was related to primary occupancy and rules of proof. So it used to be you had to provide your lease, you had to provide proof of title. Those are things that are hard to do, especially in rural situations. Maybe I live rurally, I'm a survivor, but I never had an official lease, right? So I can't get one. And my landlord doesn't want to make one up after the fact, right? Or maybe I live off the grid. This happened a lot in Santa Cruz, for example, and Oklahoma, where people were like, yeah, I had solar panels and I had, a well and a septic. So there was no way of establishing that there was a manufactured home on their property, because according to county records, it just looked like a piece of land. So I mention this because when this comes up, there are more open rules related to establishing primary occupancy, primary residency. You can get a letter from the postmaster, from a city council member, from a county council member. So like a local government entity, you can get letters from neighbors. You can send in any utility bills. It's really supposed to be much more vast. You could send a letter from a grandparent that passed down a home to a kid, but the kid never actually went and recorded it as they were supposed to. So if you run into this, just think, how can I establish this? Like, who knew that person lived there? Who can vouch that person lived there, right? Their taxes, if they've been the one paying taxes, where's the checks for that, right? So be open to that. I think that they haven't gone far enough, but that's been super, super helpful. And then the disability access piece, realistically, the most important thing in my mind is that the way that the rules changed allowed for disability support that was over and above the caps that were put in place. So if I needed a wheelchair, or I moved to a temporary home and it didn't have a refrigerator and I have diabetes, right? Previously, those were things that I could ask for, but they would be included in the IHP or ONA benefits. Now FEMA's saying you can get the full IHP and ONA benefit cap. And then on top of that, we will help you address these disability issues. So those are very positive changes, also things you might have to appeal, but very worth addressing. And the focus on equity is relatively new. The idea is they really want to try and see what needs to be addressed from an equity standpoint and then address them. So they're kind of in the we're studying this stage rather than the we have all the answers stage. Next slide. That's what I thought. I'm turning it back over to my lovely Jeanne Ortiz.
All right. Thanks, Kendall. That was a great summary of the whole process. Okay, so you know what the appeal process with FEMA is based on what Kendall described, and you need to create a letter. So Pro Bono Net's free online program allows you to do just that. You can think of this like a free TurboTax program. You enter information and then the program will create an appeal letter for you, complete with the pre-filled sections and the appropriate language required for an appeal. And the program not only saves you time, but also ensures that your appeal contains all the essential elements that Kendall talked about and as required by FEMA. This program has helped thousands of survivors and advocates over the years. It's user-friendly, mobile-friendly, and has also been revised to include updates from FEMA. This is a personal note, I used this program for my very first FEMA appeal when I was new to the process, and it was very helpful in understanding what I needed to collect from the applicant and ask her the right questions. Here are the links. This is, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's also available in Spanish. So we've included the links here for your convenience. And the way it works is that the program follows a question format to gather information from the survivor or from you. And based on the responses to the questions, the program will then generate that letter that you can revise, edit, and save to your device. And this is important because you can tailor the appeal to reflect the applicant's unique situation. One of the main advantages is that the program is accessible. It's available online. It can be accessed from anywhere. It's also free, eliminating any financial barriers that survivors may have. And all of any personal information that you enter is protected throughout the process. In addition, we recently updated the program to allow disaster survivors with disabilities to explicitly address their lack of meaningful access to FEMA's programs based on FEMA's failure to provide a reasonable accommodation. But we'll address that and go over the program during our August training. But the general idea here is that this is an advocacy tool, and it makes it easier for you as an advocate or lawyer, or for the survivor, to clearly articulate why you're requesting FEMA to reconsider its determination. One thing that's important to note is that this online program is not connected to FEMA. It is not a service provided by FEMA. There's been some confusion around that in the past. It was developed in partnership with attorneys who are familiar with the FEMA appeals process. The program does not interpret or analyze any of the information you enter. And so, it's important that you review the final letter before submitting it to FEMA. And it does not file the appeal with FEMA either on your behalf. So filing the appeal with FEMA is a separate process that you or the survivor are responsible for completing independently. You can always share this as a resource. We encourage that. We have this available across multiple sites. For example, if you're a legal aid organization and an applicant is not eligible for your services, you can feel free to direct the applicant to this program and they can complete it on their own. Okay, so I'm going to switch now to just a live demonstration so you can see how the program works. So I just went to FEMAappeals.org. It takes me to this page. We include information, all of the disclaimers. We recommend people still, find legal help in their area if they have a unique situation that they would like to address and have advice from an attorney. I'm going to click on Start Letter, and then this will take you to the Law Help Interactive platform, which is a program at Pro Bono Net. It's the program that powers this technology. I'm going to start as a guest. I have an account, but just for purposes of the demonstration, I'm going to click on the terms of use. This is always information that we provide to users. And then I'm directed to this page, which outlines the steps that the program will take me through. Where there are a few disclaimers at the beginning. I'm going to click Continue. We have throughout the program check boxes if the survivor or the applicant has a disability. That'll trigger additional sections that'll then be incorporated into the appeal letter if the applicant has that disability. So I'm going to click Continue. These are other this is other information related to the requirements of the program. And then, as Kendall was saying, what you need to include in your appeal, all of the required sections required by FEMA, those are already marked as required. So you don't have to miss that or double check that when you generate the appeal. So I'm just going to type my name here. I'm going to include a birthday because this is required. And then city, I'm going to enter San Juan. I'm going to click just the first state here. You can enter information, other information for FEMA to communicate with you. The current address is also required, so I'm going to enter that as well. And you'll get throughout the interview little pop-ups with additional information if that's something that you or the survivor want to read more about. For example, what is the disaster number? We have little pop-up windows like that. I'm going to enter Hurricane Maria as the disaster number, and then the FEMA application number, which is also required. There are a few other fields here that allow you to enter information based on the applicant's file and application with FEMA. The reasons given by FEMA, we have a pop-up on here describing all of the FEMA denial codes. So that's something that you can refer to. I'm going to copy just one reason, insufficient substantiation submitted. You can also expand the window here. It's easy if you want to type more information. as you're talking with the survivor or as you're reviewing documents from their file, you can add that there and then click continue. The reasons you believe the decision was wrong. Again, this is where you would enter that information based on what you know from the survivor situation. There is another checkbox here if the person has a disability. I am just entering pre-filled text. I'm going to click continue. This is where you would be able to describe. I'm going to make this bigger. You can describe the visits, conversations, correspondence that you've had with FEMA or the applicant has had with FEMA, and that'll be also pre-populated into the appeal letter. This is where you would list the documents that you will send attached to your FEMA appeal letter. We provide some examples here, so I'm just going to copy that. And that'll also be listed towards the end of the appeal letter, so the FEMA representatives know the documents that you've attached to the formal appeal. These are the categories that you would check if you believe that FEMA did not take those into account. So I'm just going to check a few. And then if I clicked on a disability-related question, it'll trigger additional sections. So this is one of those sections. This was reviewed by an attorney at Disability Rights Texas 2 years ago, based on also other updates from FEMA. So this is already included as part of the program. I'm going to check 2. Home damages not taken into account. These are additional fields if you want to include those. And then you get to the final section. And by click and submit, the system will not analyze, but collect all of the information that you entered. And then you'll be redirected to this page where you can download your form, your appeal letter, edit your answers, save your answers, or email the form to a third-party person. So I'm going to click download the form, and you'll see that it'll open up as a Microsoft Word document. So let me open that up right here on my other screen. And you'll see that the Microsoft Word document, it'll include a lot of the information that you saw at the beginning before starting the program. So this is information that you can review. Also, the survivor, the applicant can review before looking to their appeal. You have the denial codes here. And then finally, you have the final formal appeal here. So I'm going to make this larger. You'll see that it includes, the header has all the required information. And then all of this is information that you entered or the survivor entered and that you can edit to according to the applicant's unique situation. And finally, this is additional language that we included and the special sentence that FEMA requires, declaring that everything that you're submitted is true and correct. And then you would have the applicants sign the appeal here. And the last page is a request for information from FEMA file, which Kendall spoke to. So this would be for the applicant to request that FEMA file if they wanted to. All right, so that's how it works. We included also, just before we get to a few questions that we have, we included as part of your materials and in the chat a 5-step checklist that you can follow if you would like to, your organization in understanding how to use this program. We have covered most of this already, but it includes a step-by-step guide on using the tool and recommendations when using it with volunteers and staff. And we've also included a flyer that you can feel free to use or add to your websites or share with anyone that has been impacted by a disaster and would like to appeal FEMA. All right, so we have a few questions, and I think you already answered a few of them, right, Kendall?
Yes, I did, just for the sake of time.
Okay, great. And then we also had a question. it was submitted, and it was if what kind of assistance is available to survivors who have prior flood insurance requirement and were not able to afford or obtain?
Well, that is a very difficult question. If there are flood requirements, you have to have flood insurance, or really the only support you're likely to get from FEMA is probably debris removal related. If there's a reason that that shouldn't have happened, which I know is true for a lot of people in this past storm season, meaning the storm got so much bigger than what was expected, you could try to register or appeal, but generally the FEMA floodplains, FEMA is the one that sets them. So if FEMA said you have to have insurance or abide by these programmatic issues, you're probably going to have a hard time selling that without some hardship or something that's unusual. You could try and see if there are other FEMA programs to like stilt the house and repair it, or basic like infrastructural related things. And also like the USDA has some of them, the FHA has some of them, HCD and HUD. So it's worth it to look into those alternatives as well.
Great. And I think you, so there was a question about digital signatures and you said it was okay. There's another question, can applicant e-sign the application? Is there anything else you'd like to add to that, Kendall?
Well, I wasn't sure if the e-sign question was, can they e-sign from your Pro Bono Net platform? And I think the answer to that is no, they have to print it and sign it. Right.
Exactly. So no,
But
there's no e-signature incorporated as part of the program.
But if you had a placement of a signature, then like through DocuSign or something, then you could use that for sure.
Great. And then, so there's another question, when a disaster happens, how can we connect with people in need? So Advocates for Disaster Justice includes information specifically for disaster survivors. That site is managed by Lone Star Legal Aid and Pro Bono Net. So there are many resources there you can refer to. You can also refer the person to the American Red Cross or the Federal Emergency Management Agency's website, but we post a lot of that information to the site. Does Red Cross share financial assistance info with FEMA?
If yes, generally speaking, I can't say in every single situation. They don't if they like give a gift card, but if they're giving like a check or money order, they're generally part of the EOC, which means they have access to the shared information and why the money was provided. So I generally look at it as how was the money given, if that makes sense. If it's a gift card, probably not. If it's a check or something larger, then it's likely they share it. If it's relevant, sorry. So if the person's a registrant.
Okay. And then there's another question here. What are recommendations when in reviewing the file, survivor has provided all of requested information, but FEMA has advised that applicable documentation has not been provided?
That's a little difficult because it depends kind of on why they believe that, right? As I said, we do see certain circumstances like if you have insurance and then you provide a letter that says like, hey, I only have, like we saw this a lot with mobile and manufactured home policies where they had insurance, but the policies just really are not good. Like generally there would be like $2,500 for temporary housing, and that's supposed to last you for 2 years in California. So we all know that that's not going to last you more than like a month in California. So there was a weird thing where we had to demonstrate that the insurance company specifically said they're not paying any more money for temporary housing. So it could be that there needs to be like a creative solution to the problem. But then secondarily, I will say that honestly, I think part of this is the luck of the draw. I think that's true for survivors, whatever path they're going down. Like, do they have insurance? Don't they? Right? Do they get FEMA? Don't they? Who's their contractor? You know, when you run into that, and I think from a FEMA standpoint, you can kind of resubmit things. And I mean, I know FEMA probably doesn't encourage this, but if you get one person that's saying no, that doesn't mean another person won't say yes. So if you can't get better documentation, it can be worth it to go back with the same documentation and explain that, to say, I don't understand this. You know, we've done the best that we can with the, you know, limited access that we have, and we need clarity, or I'm begging you, please help this person.
Thanks, Kendall. And so we're at time, but there's just one more question, follow up on the signature question. So this will be our last question, but if you have additional questions, you can email us. Can you just use the diagonal or slash designation to indicate electronic signature?
You know, that is something that I can say FEMA has not come out and said yes to. I would argue that you could, especially if you created an online account and uploaded the documentation, because the account would be connected to their username, password, and email. So if you want to try that, I would say try uploading on the account. Short of that, I think that the worst thing that they could do is likely say that they're not accepting the appeal, but I don't think they wouldn't necessarily take a secondary appeal. So I think ideally it means, you know, an actual signature of some kind, or an upload on an account that can clearly identify that it's connected to their person. But short of that, I do think these are questions that need to be answered. And I think there's a lot of case law to support that in times of need, you can use electronic signatures. I mean, we've explored this widely through COVID, and I don't see why it wouldn't apply to the federal government.
All right, well, thank you so much, Kendall. We've included the contact information here. This concludes our program, but if you have additional questions, comments, please feel free to email us. We'll also be launching a post-webinar survey and following up with a post-webinar email with all of the links and information related to the program. Thank you so much for joining, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Kendall.
Yes, thank you so much. Feel free to email me. And if there's anything else you want us to cover, feel free.
All right. Take care.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
team. Much
Bye-bye.
appreciated.
You too. Bye-bye.